Hello. Once again, I better roar through this before I get throttled with overload, memory overload. Okay, we're talking about the city as objects. What is the city in totality? What's the city as a work of art? What's the city maybe perceived by people within the city? The camera lens goes to close up and backs to long shot. How do we understand the city? The post capitalist city. Yesterday we talked with Jerry DeGrice in Hobart, Tasmania, a place we consider pretty remote. And he's a landscape architect professor, talking about we have to repurpose our infrastructure. Bring back the trolleys, bring back life on the trolley lines, lower the carbon footprinting, make our infrastructure work for you, us, the collective. Then I brought up, is int the Anglo product for 200 years, 300 years? To maximize individuality, again, sprouting from modernity, not German, not French, but English modernity, that you are the lone cowboy entrepreneur. To share your backyard for an orchard, isn't that, doesn't that make you feel weird as in Anglo individualists? We have attending psychology, post-capitalist city. Why? How is that achieved? We don't want to return back to collectivist socialism we see in other cultures that are more ready to adopt this, but we have to in terms of the stewardship of our planet. COVID taught us that we need to collectivize. Jerry brought out a fact that under COVID in Tasmania, you could only go out 1 hour a day, and people chose to exercise. Food delivered, but yet they had plenty of parks. Yet in some cities, with the lack of parks, this became more difficult to exercise. We talked about the COVID-19 being 19 pounds you put on during COVID if you did not exercise. The importance of exercise, maintaining a body, and providing more public land for parks. This all sounds idyllic. How do we get around this capitalist individuality that let's consider main documents, Rousseau concerning the rights of men, Immanuel Kant, prolegomena to any future metaphysics, and his concepts that the human being is an entity unto itself. Pretty cool, all of that. But the third document could be Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, the English Anglo take on modernity. Hey man, go out there and get them. Doesn't matter what happens to the other guy. But Adam Smith prognostication was the unseen hand principle. So what do we see when other cultures learn this more or less non-collectivist, three-pronged pedagogy on modernity? Rousseau, Kant, and Adam Smith. Very distinct to their cultures. French, German, and English. 200 years ago, about more, 230, 40 years ago. Wellspring of both the American Revolution and the French Revolution and the attending 1948 revolution that sort of propelled Marx into highlight, Hegel taking the Kantian deontology that human lives, human entities are entities in themselves, can never be measured by utilitarianism, but therein is a contrast. Okay, let's go further. The invisible landscape. We're talking about types of cities. Cities, so remember these three prongs: the French, the German, the Anglo, Adam Smith. and our discussion with Jerry is like, if we take away, I'll call it the Versailles pomposity in Levittown, that you are a little middle class service industry accountant, bean counter, so forth. You're not BOP, bottom of the pyramid, working the factories, even, arrogantly not working the agriculture. How do you return back to this notion that land, as Jerry mentioned, opening up the infrastructure to not only maximize it, but collectivize it? And as we mentioned, in the post peak oil city, where 10 calories of food, 10 calories of petroleum are needed to bring in 1 calorie of food, what is the new proximity to food? This, again, is what COVID has taught us. We need parks. We need to exercise. We need an analog relationships to our bodies again. We don't need to be fooled by poor diet, poor health. These things are both surveillance tools and fantastic. They monitor my health. They keep me up with what I should do. I bike 5 miles daily. I'm not quite an astute observer of my food, but the empathy of tuning the modernist individual, Rousseau, Kant, Adam Smith, is also in perhaps a return back to, let's call it an Epicurean collectivization. How, as Jerry said, how we can make our infrastructure, our Levittown house, work for us, work for the collective, thus work for us. So forth, going on. Invisible extractivism and the greenhouse. Back to nature, living in the future. The Global Cities Index places, Saskia Sassen and others have analyzed global cities, which includes diversity, not merely size, not merely economics, but diversity, a number of factors. Set global agendas, whether hubs is global integration. Integration is important. Booms, no surprise. New York, London, Paris, Tokyo, Beijing, Hong Kong, Los Angeles, Chicago, Singapore, Washington, D.C. These American cities still assume a position on global integrations, engines of growth, engines of ideas. New York certainly is an idea city. I live here, it's biased. And this is an analysis. Alpha cities, when considering this integration, finance, place of exchange of ideas, place for the handshake, London and New York. That is it. Alpha plus cities, Beijing, Dubai, Hong Kong, Paris, Shanghai, Singapore. I used to live in Singapore and I lived in Tokyo. So these are interesting indices. Lectured in Beijing, lectured in Dubai, Hong Kong, never been, Paris, been in and out of that. Global cities initiatives, move this over a little bit, classifies wealthy, extremely large metropolitan areas. Now, certainly the largest city is Tokyo. But Osaka is bigger than New York City in terms of population. Paris, Los Angeles, London. So we're looking at, if we have to integrate agriculture, Jerry even mentioned vertical farming, integrate all surface of buildings with possible biomass. It sounds pretty radical, but vertical farming and so forth. It's an idea. And here's an analysis. So if these are giant cities, how do we integrate intensive farming, bringing the food to the persons? We talked about bicycle culture, at least I noticed in New York, electric bike culture. Jerry said the Hobart is topographically challenged, like San Francisco, so therefore electric bikes hold a greater promise. They can help you hill climb, or the motor kicks in. The city bike certainly Went to electric bikes a couple of years ago, and they're fun. You're right out of the stoplight. On a flat city like New York in general, but I live on the highest point in probably New York, Windsor Terrace up near Greenwood, top point. Global cities. Here's the release. Cities by brand value. New York City, Tokyo, probably because of its size, but also the influence of Japanese anime culture. The sort of it is a place of new ideas, very Japanese ideas, but the idea of translating things Japanese to things world, like boy bands, anime, certain features of movies, certain features of tech culture translates. Singapore is right there, even though it's a city of barely 4 million. Very contained city, but it likes, very contradictory city, likes to think of it as a top place. World's most talked about cities: Tokyo, New York, London, Paris, Madrid, Dubai, Rome, Barcelona, Seoul. I lived in Rome. Very nice city. Very conducive for many things, but does not make the grade in terms of diversity, diverse ideas. It's a very relaxed and relaxing city. I remember running from Prati to Porto Patese on the river early in the morning, a jog. In as soon as the sun came up in the middle of August, nobody there. It becomes abandoned. It was very, very pleasant. Most important city in terms of finance is the category above. Zurich made the cut there. World's best cities in 2021, year after COVID: London, New York, Paris, Moscow, Tokyo. Here we see Moscow make its thing. Resonance evaluates each city across 6 dimensions: place, product, programming, arts, culture, entertainment, culinary scene. New York, London. People, immigration and diversity, prosperity, and promotion. Stories coming out of these places. So this is the global index of the top cities. Again, little Singapore makes the cut, and Madrid makes the cut at the end. Barcelona, fabulous city. Dubai, strange city, but really theatrically strange, coming out of a Muslim culture. Theatrically very important and potent. The tall Burj Khalifa, the buildings, the clubs, the idea, kind of a contradictory idea of excess and hedonism in a deeply Islamic culture. Strange. London, New York, Paris, Tokyo, Singapore. Forms of centralization: centralized deconcentration, delegation, de-evolution. Sorry, let me move my can't do it that well. Here we go. So we notice local fiscal, local responsibility, local authority. We see move these blocks around. We see different focus. New York certainly is not a centralized town, but it certainly is not a delegated town. In that local fiscal autonomy is positioned. You see these floating blocks within bureaucratic authorities. So you see lower left authority. Floating blocks represent bureaucratic control and focus, which creates fragility. Moving further, future of urbanism in China. Can we build livable city? The idea of city mappings. Prude ego, its destruction heralded an end to a concept of spatial modernity from Rousseau, Kant, Adam Smith, that every individual unit, plus making a dyad out of perhaps cisgender persons to replicate themselves, needed attending space, and that space would all look alike. Ironically, famous housing projects located in St. Louis, it was praised for its well-intentioned goal of creating massive, affordable, and efficient housing. 5,800 units during the peak of the Jim Crow segregation. So this was a place for the underserved, people of color, separate but equal, was deemed illegal. Which was once planned two separate neighborhoods of home became one. This became one of the slab cities, as we mentioned, in Dream Cities, and it became crime traps, degraded places, simply because of this effacing modernist equality across the line, which ironically built by elitist architects Le Corbusier planned, but intended to be housed by economically disadvantaged and people of color. So it hovered as a solution to Jim Crow, but became part of the problem. And it was dynamited, destroyed within 12 years, I think, of its inception. And according to Jenks, architectural critics, this heralded the not just postmodern movements in architecture, but postmodern movements in all the arts, all the culture, that perhaps the high ideals, the grand narratives of Rousseau, Kant, and Adam Smith are not to be aspired to. One could say this is the action, the dynamiting, the demolition, beginning of before the internet. Well, no, actually not. DARPA and the let's call it Cold War internet had already been in place. Let's consider this perhaps the beginning. I only use, not pejoratively, use the word snowflake modernity as post Rousseau, Kant, and Adam Smith to a degree, still maintaining these things. We will look at these Chinese cities, how they're actually like science fiction movie sets. Very, very aesthetic, very much about power. This is Shanghai. Moreover, the urban population fast growth lead to larger list of megacities, many more megacities. The global is growing fast and near inhabited. The shifts to bigger economy, bigger challenges, more starchitecture, architecture by star architects, become part of that kind of brand value of the city. Did you go to the Burj Khalifa? Did you go to the Empire State Building? Did you see the Brooklyn Bridge? So forth. Revolutions from 3D printing. As we see in some Evolo sketches, this idea of cranes doing 3D printing is not far off. I make my students get into 3D printing just to understand building materials aesthetics and kind of an ease of economics if it is made en masse. Neurodiversity and biophilia, the future workplace. Neurodiversity, how do we not put people in cubicles, but make these spaces so that they exchange ideas within the workplace? The coronavirus pandemic demanded new needs and significant changes in our life, in relationships at work, consumption habits, increased inequality. Doing things on Zoom, kind of anti-analog, is not a solution. When we see us going back to more communal workspaces, we will attempt to create an environment that is more conducive. As we saw in the Minneapolis riots, coming out of a month and a half of COVID sequestering, we saw an explosion of the disadvantage and the police, out of the action of the police brutality that had everything to do with racism, but also with the kind of blasting cap of COVID and highlighting the people disadvantaged within a city. the most livable cities, Auckland, New Zealand, there it is. But it did not show up on any of the lists that we saw previously. So why? How? Why is it livable? Why would we want to live there? Architecture, design, post-pandemic, 18 museums. As we saw, exhibitions, culture, restaurants are extremely important. And Jerry talked yesterday about taking away 2 or 3 car spaces in the restaurants, thus decreasing car traffic and further promoting the restaurant culture in New York during COVID. I spent many an evening out there with long johns on in the winter in a breezy, I called them little huts outside of restaurants. Museums across the world are beginning to show signs of reopening. Most architectural and design events are scheduled for 2020 have been pushed a year or two. Certainly some of my work. New York expands outdoor activities, open up boulevards. It's the boulevards. New York realized it is a city, as we saw in the index, about culture, openness, Epicurean things, cuisine, that they need this openness. They need the traffic to these sites. Open boulevards program. I like it. I park my van, but I ride my bike almost everywhere. So, strange dichotomy. Yes and no. Building back. Richard Florida outlines his vision for. Hold on. I guess I can't move. Oh, there it is. Richard Florida outlines his vision for a post-pandemic city. The guy who wrote Rise of the Creative Class, that post-industrial economies depend upon these creative classes, mostly in the internet industries, but also some analog. America's central business suffered greatly during COVID-19. Job loss, business, but have a good chance to recover if stakeholders can capitalize on trends. The boulevards, the exchange of ideas, keeping low, as Jerry mentioned, keeping low carbon footprints under Zoom, but reintegrating the analog into these places. The rise of the creative class and new urban crisis. Author Urbanist went over these things. Future workplace that isn't a workplace. Will we go back from our couches? I know I have to go back to lecture at Stony Brook. Take that train, 2 hours there, 2 hours back. Will we change after COVID? There's a lot of speculation and debate on how we and whether we'll return to our old habits of working in the office 5 days a week. I don't think so. If working from home creates equal or greater productivity. However, many believe that the future of the workplace will largely be the focus of balance between in-person and in-office. The analog exists, as we heard with Jerry, making your infrastructure work, not just for you, but the community, sharing orchards, sharing gardens. You can't eat a PowerPoint report. That's just a fact. You can't get a virtual hug. Loving, intimacy, eating, to a certain extent, health. You can't set a bone through the internet. What will workplaces become? Will they become more like lofts and studios? So forth. Strategic design should reflect a post. Sorry, this is not a way to get it up there, but I can't move it. Should reflect a post-pandemic workforce culture. More than a year into the worldwide experiment for working at home, we have not yet landed on a perfect formula. Really? This looks too much like a kiddie talk show to me, or Pee-wee's Playhouse. I don't like it. But we can not only, I know many friends, myself included, enjoyed working in coffee shops. I certainly love it with good Wi-Fi. They might give you the stank eye if you work there too long. You pay for expensive coffee in place of real estate. There are places like Grumpy's, Cafe Grumpy's, won't even let you open the laptop to show your collaborators. Boo! In a paperless society, having a meeting at a coffee shop, it's not the fact that I'm working at Grumpy's, but I'm showing people what project ideas. You cannot even crack open your laptop. I understand it. They want you to keep moving, and certainly the sorry about the shakes here. Restaurant keeps moving, and this is part of the spiel. Mars House, one of the first, Krista Kim created first NFT, non-fungible transaction digital file experience in virtual reality, was just acquired, purchased. Um, Kind of a new idea brought out of blockchain technology that these things are artifacts, even though they're ephemeral, intangible. You can sell them. To me, they represent a lot of pump and dump pyramid schemes. Last week, 2 weeks ago, an Italian artist for $10,000, I think it was, no, more than that, sold an invisible art object. So much like the tulip craze of 17th century, 18th century Holland, I think these NFTs will have their 15 minutes of fame, but coming out of the pandemic, it's a little bit of a pump and dump scheme. Tech class cynicism, pandemic, real estate. COVID inspired both cutting edge architectural design solutions and broad speculation about future developments in the field. Technology that directly affects working class communities, Minneapolis, is mostly limited to restrictive measures that fail to address already urgent residential health hazards, administrative conveniences, bureaucracies, for developers that allow them to circumvent public scrutiny, race, class, gender, ghettos, the inability to earn a living, to pay for the rent. Even in a very liberal town like Minneapolis, we saw this collision out of an act of brutality coming out of COVID and the need to keep the money flowing. Shot heard around the world. Diverse scales of green in Chinese urbanism. We see China seriously trying to attack this notion of post-peak oil. How green is a city? Living in Singapore was interesting. The vertical gardens had already started. Incredibly green city. It's pretty much a jungle city, 50 miles north of the equator. Very hot. But while they add plants and other items, they add a lot of air conditioning. So I would wonder about the carbon footprint efficiency of a place like Singapore. Stockton, High Street to be demolished makes way for a park. As Jerry said, we see demolishing of certain areas to make the parks, to exercise in, to give people their real estate, to exercise, to enjoy the out of doors. Many post-industrial towns like Detroit are already doing this. Religion of the city, cars, mass transit, and corona. The car as a detachable room will face another sort of manifestation, as it certainly has during COVID. Many of the upper middle class that I knew took the opportunity of COVID to head out of town to do their work on Zoom. They're now having to return not only for the face-to-face meetings, but for, as we saw in the top, Indices, enjoy the culture, the restaurants, the amenities that a cosmopolitan place like London, New York, London, Paris, Tokyo, not so diverse, but the Moscow, all of these cities that hit the culture indice as places you want to visit because of this level of Epicureanism. We shall hear more in the next talk. Check you then. Ciao.